choices. Okay, so it should be starting to record now. And this is a terrific turnout. Looks like we have 82 participants, so, and counting. And I want to welcome you to this town hall meeting. The purpose of this town hall meeting is in response to what we're seeing across the country, state legislatures introducing and passing legislation that targets, for the most part, LGBT youth, in particular transgender youth. And we wanted to talk about that and what this means, what might be the motivation behind this, and what can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen in Michigan. And we have a terrific panel of speakers tonight who have graciously agreed to lend their time and their talent to share some really important information with you. And our first speaker is Amritha Ventakar. I want to make sure I say it right, Amritha Ventakaran. Did I say that properly?
You were close. Very close.
I apologize for that. I know Amritha very well. She is with the Human Rights Campaign, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jay and the Michigan Community Center, who really spearheaded putting this event together. This town hall comes out of the fact that we are seeing increased attacks on our community around the country. And I just want to acknowledge for everyone that the last few weeks, the last few months have been particularly heavy, right? We are seeing, another record number of attacks on our community, and a lot of it feels sad and hopeless. Kids are scared and parents are scared. And I hope that we are able to leave this meeting today with a renewed sense of fight and understand all of the legal ways and organizing ways that we can ensure rights for our entire community, because we have the power to do that. We really, really do. We just got to work together. And given the showing tonight, I think that we're all ready to do that. So just as a top line, I wanted to give you some statistics about the state legislative session. State legislative sessions are generally shorter than legislative sessions. Michigan is the exception that has a year-round legislative session, but we're kind of seeing this flurry of activity because this is the time of year where a lot of state legislatures are actually in session. So states can be passing new bills and they move very quickly. Right now, HRC is tracking approximately 600 pieces of legislation that relate to the LGBTQ community. And over half of those are that we don't support, that are anti-equality in some way. 139 include anti-transgender legislation. 40 of those have healthcare bans. We're seeing a huge increase in sports bans. And as you all know, seeing bills that limit teachers' abilities to teach, that limit education for kids, and some religious refusals. We do have some good news. There have been 3 positive bills signed into law this legislative session in New York, Illinois, Colorado. So it is not all bad. And we are working really, really hard to stop these bills in state legislatures. And we will, do everything we can, from working with business coalitions to helping ERGs self-organize themselves to tell their employers if they don't support these policies, to having hard conversation with legislatures who are just not informed enough about our issues, to try to get them to vote our way. So right now we have 11 harmful bills that have passed into law in 7 states. And then we've got about 6 more that we are waiting to see if they end up getting signed or vetoed as we continue to work through this process. That's a lot. And it is a unique moment in the fight for our rights is shifting a bit from national discourse to localized discourse in the state legislatures. And that often can get even more overwhelming. The good news is that we are closer to our state leges than we are to the US Congress. We know these people, they live in our community, and we have the real ability to work with them through lobby days, letters, and to organize around these issues. When I am doing this work, I remember 2 things. One, it's that organizing works, even with legislators who are not familiar with LGBTQ issues. even having basic conversations about what gender affirming care looks like and what kids need to be in an inclusive environment in school drastically changes public perception and drastically changes how legislators feel about these issues. So that organizing does work. And the second thing that I actually our annual volunteer event, the Equality Convention in HRC with this past month, is that the parents of LGBTQ youth, of trans and non-binary kids, are intense. They are fierce and they are fighting for the rights of their kids, and they are never going to give up. And I try to channel that energy and stand in solidarity with them as much as humanly possible, because that's the way we're going to win this. There's going to be a lot of stuff happening at the local level, but thankfully we have some excellent people who are really familiar with Michigan law. And I'm going to be working super hard to make sure we elect a pro-equality Michigan State Senate, pro-equality governor, to make sure that we send a clear message that these laws are not welcome in Michigan. And with that, I will turn it over to Jay.
I think, oh, okay, I was muted for a second, but that's okay. Thank you so much, Amrita. And by the way, I hadn't mentioned this. If people have any questions, if you want to put them in the chat, and at the end of the presentations, we will take the time. We're going to go through them and answer your questions that you might have. Our next speaker is Dr. Mo Connolly, who's a pediatrician who specializes working with LGBTQ youth and is involved with the Ruth Ellis Health Center in Detroit. And she's going to talk about gender affirming care for transgender youth.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It is such a pleasure to be here today. My name is Mo Connolly. I use she, her pronouns. And as Jay said, I am a pediatrician who has the pleasure, the privilege of caring for transgender and non-binary young people. I'm going to jump into a little bit about the specifics of what we're talking about here. I just want to name that there are a lot of people on this call who are also experts, whether it is their lived experience taking medication or doing medical processes to affirm their gender, or maybe their loved ones. So I am wearing a white coat right now, but there's a call full of expertise. And we're just going to jump into some of the details real quick when we're talking about the topics of some of these bills. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick. We'll see if that works. Can everybody see that? We good? Awesome. Okay. So real quick, we're just going to run through some data. I'm a nerd wearing a little white coat over here. We love to get into some numbers. In terms of when we're talking about young people, how many young people might we be talking about? And we don't have a national survey from the US, but New Zealand surprisingly did a national survey related to gender identity and found that 1.2% of the young people that responded to their national survey reported being transgender or non-binary. And so I think it's really important to recognize that we are going to be encountering trans and non-binary young people in all of our youth serving institutions, right? They are part of our communities. They are part of our families. Again, there may be some trans and non-binary young people on this call. And so this is something that we need to understand. And we also need to recognize that these young people are in our communities and need to be cared for. The numbers that I'm going to show next, again, unfortunately, I'm sure there are folks on this call who are familiar with this data, but essentially trans and non-binary young people experience disproportionate rates of things like depression, suicidal ideation, and self-harm. And I think I work with parents a lot. They come into clinics saying, I Googled this and these were the numbers that I saw. And I think it's really important to recognize that there's actually a lot that we can do to intervene on these health disparities. And gender affirming care is one of those things. So again, it can be really scary when we see these numbers. And obviously, this is our prerogative in healthcare to address these disparities, but there's a lot that we can do. And then in terms of other data, there are, data that point to increased bullying, increased, negative experiences at school. And again, it is our job as communities to support and care for these young people. Just really quickly, when we're talking about gender affirming care or options for transition, we're talking about the process that someone goes through to bring how they move through the world in alignment with their identity. That can look different for everybody. And I have three amazing trans women on this slide, Jazz Jennings, Laverne Cox, and Janet Mock. And I bring that up to say that there's no right way to transition. There's also no right way to be trans or non-binary. Okay, so transition can include non-medical interventions. It can include medications. It can include surgery. It can include all of those things or none of those things, right? And it's our job to affirm and respect people's identities, regardless of the path that they choose to take. But that being said, some people decide that taking medication or pursuing surgeries are right for them. And again, when we talk about this from a healthcare perspective, these are things that are very straightforward, that can be done quite easily, that are not particularly medically complex. It's just a matter of supporting young people and really kind of partnering with them along the way. And so I do just want to point out, when we're talking about the importance of this work, right? The stakes when we're talking about perhaps denying access to gender affirming care for young people, the body of data is growing, but I will point to a study in the journal Pediatrics, which is like the primary journal for the American Academy of Pediatrics. This was actually done, the study was done in the Netherlands. It was a 6-year study, and it followed 500 participants as they went through medical transition and also surgical transition. And over time, those young people's psychological functioning improved, right? And by the end of the study, you can see in bold, the mental health concerns that young people had were comparable to the general population, right? So the idea is that we have an intervention that can directly address those health disparities that I just pointed out, right? We have it within our capacity in healthcare to intervene to potentially provide life-saving medication for people. And it is our medical and ethical imperative to do so. I'm not alone in this. This is supported by all of the major medical organizations in the United States and many globally as well. This is not new. This is not cutting edge. This is just like regular old healthcare. And I think it's important to remember that. As you may know, as you may be aware, this access to this care is medically necessary, and there are amazing resources out there for providers to do this care well, to do it. The WPATH guidelines are just in the process of being updated. But the point is that, again, this isn't new, this isn't experimental. This is stuff that we know works and can be life-saving and set young people on a path towards health and wellness for the rest of their lives. I also just want to say that in general, not only related to transgender care specifically, but some of the other work, or I would say some of the other legislation related to things like Don't Say Gay in Florida. As someone who works with young people all the time, the idea that there are these groups of people who are coming together against their identity or against their very existence, as you can all imagine, is very difficult for young people and can have a chilling effect on young people who maybe want to explore or express their identity to loved ones or in their community. And so I think it's just really important it's not just about the outcome of the legislation, it's also about the message that young people are receiving. And I will just say, I ran through some data. Here is, a bunch of studies that we can point to, but really as a provider, I get the opportunity to sit in front of trans and non-binary young people every single day I'm in clinic. And I can tell you that this care is essential. And for the people who are putting forth these bills, I guarantee they have never sat with a young person and heard their stories. We can do all the studies in the world, but I think just recognizing the resilience, the creativity, the determination that trans and non-binary young people, demonstrate as they're pursuing what they need to be okay, is exceptionally important. And again, it's not just the data, it's my lived experience as a provider. This care is medically necessary and life-saving. And with that, I will pass it back to Jay.
Thank you, Dr. Mo. That's great. And I think, what Dr. Mo was saying is that when you look at the actual facts, this is not experimental treatment. This has been scientifically proven, and this is often the medical care, the gender affirming care, is with the consent of the youth, either parents or guardians. And what some of these bills you hear about just recently passed in Alabama that would criminalize doctors that provide gender affirming treatment. You've probably heard about Texas investigating parents who are supportive of their kids receiving gender affirming care. And in Arkansas, a similar law that's currently being challenged in the law. And I just wanted to share before I introduce Christina, a couple of weeks ago, I got a call from a teacher in a Metro Detroit school district. And this was probably in response to what we call the Don't Say Gay law that just recently passed in Florida. And she said she was told by her principal that if a student came out to her as LGBTQ, that she was not allowed to acknowledge it, nor was she allowed to say or do anything that was supportive of an LGBT student because the district could get sued by a parent. Now, obviously, that's not the law in Michigan. We don't have a Don't Say Gay bill. And I wanted to introduce Christina Paxell, who's an attorney with the Troon Law Firm, which provides legal counsel to 500 Michigan school districts. And she's gonna talk about what does the law say regarding a school district's responsibility to treat LGBT students fairly and to provide them with a safe and supportive learning environment. And I'll turn it over to you, Christina.
Thank you, Jay. So yeah, like Jay mentioned, I'm an attorney with Troon Law Firm, and we represent about over 500 public school districts. We also represent intermediate school districts, which are the groups that oversee school districts, charter schools, and community colleges. And I do a lot of work on student issues, especially with regard to Title IX. And I have done, since I started at Troon, a lot of work on specifically issues with LGBTQ students. And Jay and I have presented a lot together with the Michigan Department of Education's LGBTQ project. So what I'll start off by saying are two things. One, Michigan has a great piece of guidance that was passed in 2016. The State Board of Education put out a statement. It has a longer title. I can never remember the fully exact words of the title, but once I stop speaking, I can put the link in the chat. And essentially the State Board of Education's guidance on creating I think it's a safe and supportive learning environment for LGBTQ students. It's like a 9-page document, and it's something that we use a lot when we are working with our clients, and that we recommend our clients use when they're working with parents, because it's not written in legalese. It's not something that says wherewithal and thereat for and whereas. It's written in a way that is easy to understand. And it explains some of the things that Dr. Mo was talking about with regard to the higher rates of suicidal ideation and depression, and then also has suggestions and recommendations for how schools can create a safe and supportive learning environment for their LGBTQ students. So we cite to that guidance a lot. That is non-binding because it's guidance, but we fall back on it a lot because parts of it are built on parts of federal law that a school would run afoul of if it were to not follow certain parts of, if it were not to do certain things to affirm transgender or other types of students. So one area I know that we got a lot of questions on this morning is we get a lot of questions sort of to what Jay was saying is, well, do we have to use a student's preferred name and pronouns? And if they come out to us, can we affirm that? And certainly both Title IX and the Equal Protection Act say that, yes, schools do need to do that. And I really liked what Dr. Mo said when she was talking, where she said, this isn't new, this is normal. And the same is true for the law. This isn't brand new in 2022. These are not the first cases we've heard of this. In 2016, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is binding on Michigan, heard a case about a transgender student wanting to use a bathroom that matched with their gender identity. And the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of that student and granted what's called an injunction, which is basically a court order that says to the school, you have to let this student use the bathroom that corresponds with their gender identity. So this isn't new. And this has been happening across the nation since 2016, since even before at the federal court level, even at the state court level. And the case law that we've been seeing overwhelmingly is in favor of transgender students being able to access the sex segregated facilities. And by that, I mean locker rooms, bathrooms that match with their gender identity, in making changes to student records without legal name changes or any medical documentation, and generally sort of affirming the student's gender identity. And the case law is also kind of the cases where people have brought cases alleging bodily privacy or other violations, saying that cisgender students are having their rights violated by having to share a bathroom with a transgender person. Those cases have routinely been dismissed and not really held any traction. So when we communicate with our clients, that's the legal landscape that we are telling them about. Here's what the case law looks like for a long time now. This is not new information. This guidance from the State Board of Education was created under a different governor with a different State Board of Education. It has lasted through and not been changed. The Office for Civil Rights under the previous presidential administration, still then, even that administration still issued guidance that said they supported and affirmed transgender students, and they would investigate incidences of discrimination against LGBTQ students, and even specifically cited to teachers not using a student's preferred name and pronouns as something that could be discrimination or harassment. So that's something that we like to point out, basically the idea that this isn't new. This isn't an area where this is something that where in 2022, suddenly no one has heard about this before, and this is the first time where we have case law on it. That's not the case. And especially we're helped by the, I always pronounce this wrong, the Bostick versus Clayton County. Jay's giving me the thumbs up because it was the ACLU's case. The Bostick versus Clayton County Supreme Court case in June of 2022 helped us a lot in terms of saying that Title VII and employment law said that discrimination on the basis of sex necessarily included gender identity and sexual orientation. Other courts then took that interpretation and said, yep, this applies to Title IX and applies to schools as well. So did the Biden administration in their executive orders and the Biden administration's Office for Civil Rights. So now when we are meeting with clients on issues like this, our recommendations come a lot of times we will send quotes from the State Board of Education guidance or quotes from the Office for Civil Rights guidance, and all of those different things. So if you're reading those, that's a lot of the same stuff we're communicating to our clients. People don't always call us, but when they do, that's the information that we're providing to them. We do presentations with MDE. I've written some articles about it. We do presentations to groups themselves, school boards, to teachers, to counselors, to administrators on these issues because we get questions about it. And we are trying to ensure that schools work within the bounds of the law and make sure that they're not running afoul of Title IX and the Equal Protection Clause when they are working with these students.
That's great. Thank you so much, Christina. And I have to say, we in Michigan are very fortunate to have the Troon Law Firm because they do provide accurate advice to really a significant majority of the school districts. And anytime when we've had a problem with a school district, with a particular position or policy regarding LGBT students, and they happen to be represented by the Troon Law Firm, the law firm has provided the legal advice to make the school district, to persuade the school district to change their policy and do the right thing. So we're very, very fortunate to have them doing this work and providing the legal guidance to the majority of Michigan school districts. Just as a follow-up to what Christina said, it's important to note that there have been a number of legal challenges raised to some of this legislation that is passed. Many of you are familiar with the transgender sports bans. These are laws that prohibit transgender students from being able to play high school sports in accordance with their gender identity. On at least 2 occasions, courts in Idaho, as well as in West Virginia, have struck down these laws as being unconstitutional. As Christina mentioned, they violate the equal protection rights of transgender students, and they're also in violation of Title IX. That's a civil rights law that says you can't discriminate against students on the basis of sex. The ACLU and Lambda right now has a legal challenge against Texas's policy that requires Child Protective Services to investigate parents of transgender students when they're being provided with gender affirming care. Right now, there's been a preliminary injunction. That means it's a legal order preventing the state from investigating parents based on constitutional provisions concerning privacy and violation of equal protection rights. There recently was a lawsuit filed against Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, which also raises issues about censorship, First Amendment rights, as well as discrimination against LGBTQ students as a result of the provisions in that law. So there are various legal challenges, and for the most part, right now, at this point in time, the courts are doing the right thing, and they're finding these laws to be not only discriminatory, but in violation of civil rights and constitutional laws. Whether that will hold true, since we're seeing such a great proliferation in so many states, we'll have to see. But so far, we've been successful at challenging that. So let's talk about Michigan. What's different about Michigan that, we're not seeing some of this stuff at this point in time? And I'm going to be perfectly honest. We are fortunate to have a governor who's made it very clear that she will veto this legislation. We do have our legislative majority is controlled by the Republican Party, both the state House and the state Senate. And but for the ability of the governor to be able to veto this legislation, that's why we have not seen this thus far in terms of any successful efforts. So it's very important to note when we talk about how do we prevent this from happening in Michigan, we know that this year there will be an election in November. I'm not telling anybody who to vote for or anything like that, but I am saying it is essential that all of us participate in the election and that we vote, and we vote informed, and we have an understanding where the candidates stand on these issues with regards to LGBTQ people, and particularly LGBTQ youth. There is a significant difference between some of these candidates who will be running to challenge the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, as well as the governor on LGBTQ issues. So we have to participate. We cannot sit this one out. And I think, some of the proponents behind this legislation, they are probably banking on the idea that, in a midterm election, not a lot of people participate, and that there's just a sense of complacency, and that a lot of people will be staying home and will not be participating. We cannot allow that to happen. In the past 4 years, we've been making some very positive gains towards LGBT rights administratively. We've gotten better policies that allow transgender people to get accurate identity documents, birth certificates, driver's licenses, state IDs. We have a much better policy with regards to insurance companies, particularly with Medicaid, having to cover medically necessary care for transgender people. We have a governor who's issued several executive orders protecting LGBT people against discrimination. That is all great, but all of that, since it's administratively, could be rescinded, the policy could change as a result of the election. So the first and foremost thing that we have to do is we have to vote. We have to make sure the people that we care about and who care about us, that they're going to vote, and that they're going to vote informed, and that they have an understanding of where these candidates' positions are on with regards to issues that we care about, LGBT people. The second thing is we have to really call this out for what it is. The spate of these bills are no coincidence. And they're not that each individual legislature thinks up some language to try to pass a bill. These are cookie cutters pieces of legislation that are being rolled out by conservative think tanks, and they're being used by politicians as a cynical political calculation to try to gin up their base and to increase their fundraising capability. They've decided that this is a cultural issue that will, in terms of their political base, this will fire them up, that they will show up to vote, come election time. And then they're banking on people who do support LGBTQ rights to stay at home. And when you look at the actual facts and information, that, in terms of the issues like Dr. Mo was presenting about what is the medical consensus regarding gender affirming care, when we have that kind of information, we can refute the rationale that they purportedly give for a transgender healthcare ban. When we know the actual facts and information regarding transgender athletes, that athletic capability depends on the individual in the sport, we can refute the rationale behind why there needs, why they purport that there needs to be a ban on transgender kids being able to play sports in accordance with their gender identity. When we can call out a don't say gay bill that, although doesn't mention the word gay in Florida, makes it clear that you can't talk about sexual orientation or gender identity, not only between kindergarten and third grade, but figuratively all the way up through high school, and the damage that can cause and what that means for LGBTQ kids to even be recognized and acknowledged in their school district. When we do things like that, we have to educate the public so they have an understanding, because when they get that kind of information, they, majority wise will oppose this kind of legislation. So we have to call it out for what it is. And we have to be aggressive about that sort of thing. Some of you might not be aware, but last year there was legislation that was introduced that would prevent trans kids from being able to play sports. Now, the governor made it very clear right off the bat that she wouldn't sign this if it passed. But I also want to believe that it was the mobilization too of the LGBTQ community that showed up at a legislative hearing. Dr. Moe spoke, one of the few people who was permitted to speak at this committee hearing, but her information that she provided blew the opposition out of the water. I mean, she, we were able to present facts. And fortunately, that bill has not gone any further since that hearing almost a year ago, or in the summer, almost a year ago. We have to be aggressive about that. And we also have to make sure that our elected officials who are supportive of LGBTQ rights speak out, and that they speak out aggressively, and that they call it for what it is. This is me talking from my heart, but I find it so despicable that politicians would use for their own political aims attacking the most vulnerable members of our community, LGBTQ youth, in order to achieve some temporary source of power. A majority of these people know that this is not a problem. They know that this is not a solution, and yet they're using it for their political aims. And we have to call it for what it is. And I believe that if we do, and if we have these conversations, and we talk not only amongst the members of the LGBT community, but our allies, about anybody who cares about us and our lives, we can make a difference to ensure that this doesn't happen in the state of Michigan. And once again, what separates Michigan from the other states is we have a governor at this point in time, currently a governor, who says that she will veto this legislation, that it will not become law. And that is what is at stake in November. And we have to be engaged, and we have to be involved, and we have to ensure that anybody who cares about us is registered to vote and is going to vote informed. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia Thornton, who is the LGBTQ liaison to the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And she's going to talk about what remedies are available now for LGBTQ individuals who are experiencing discrimination. Thanks, Cynthia. And I think, oh yeah, there we go.
Yep. Good evening, everyone. I just attempted to share my screen. Did it show up?
Yep, it showed up.
Okay, great. That's a lovely thing. So great to see so many people here. Truly appreciate the opportunity to share space with you. As Jay said, my name is Cynthia L. Thornton. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the LGBTQ liaison for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. So in my role, part of the thing that I do is educate the public about services provided by the department, but I also inform people about their rights under the civil rights laws that we enforce, particularly as relates to LGBTQ matters. As most of you know, the law around LGBTQ issues is changing a lot. And by July, we expect to learn whether sexual orientation and gender identity will be protected under our state civil rights law, the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. In the meantime, however, it is important for Michiganders to know that they have actionable rights now. These are the rights that are encapsulated for the Department of Civil Rights at this time, and I have highlighted specifically education, because I am aware that some people don't know that. So here it is in writing. And as a result of the interpretive statement adopted by the Civil Rights Commission on May 21st, 2018, that protection specifically includes discrimination that is based on gender identity and sexual orientation. Some might ask why this is important. Because these are just a few of the incidents that have occurred over the past year with walkouts, with harassment at schools, sometimes resulting in actual injury to students. And as you can see, it's been across the state. There's not any one place where it has occurred. It has been a little bit of everywhere, with the exception of large urban areas. But it's important that we recognize that students are being harmed, that teachers are being harmed, at least potentially. And it's important for the Department of Civil Rights for them to know that they do have options. If they feel that they are being harassed, discriminated against, otherwise being treated differently because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity or some other protected basis, they do have the right to file a complaint. So I encourage anyone who may be having these experiences to contact me for more information about how to file a complaint or to give an ear to their issue to give them further direction if other resources are needed. I'm going to keep this short because I want people to have an opportunity to ask questions. So I will stop sharing here and turn it over to Jay.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Yeah, since May of 2018, people have been able to file discrimination complaints with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And Cynthia specifically mentioned we expect a decision from the Michigan Supreme Court by the end of July this year. What they will be deciding is whether or not the Bostock case that Christina mentioned, which held that discrimination in employment against LGBT people is sex discrimination. Does that mean that our state civil rights law, that as Cynthia mentioned, prohibits discrimination in employment, housing, education, and public accommodations? Does that Supreme Court decision mean that our state civil rights laws comprehensively protect LGBT people from discrimination? And we are cautiously optimistic that we might get a good decision. And another reason why elections are important, because as a result of the 2020 elections, for the first time in more than 2 decades, Michigan Supreme Court has a progressive majority on it, something that was never there before. So I'm going to stop talking because I know we got a lot of questions in the chat. And Dakota, would you be willing to kind of read off some of these questions, take some of these questions, and then we can figure out who might be the most appropriate person to answer them? And Dakota, are you there? If not, I guess I could look in the chat.
I think we've got
take a look. Oh.
a first good question right off the bat, just going in backwards order from Dave Garcia at Affirmations. Jay, can you talk a bit more about privacy protections and how current anti-abortion laws are related to privacy for LGBTQ issues?
Yes, yes. So some of you might be aware that the US Supreme Court will be deciding an abortion case involving a law in Mississippi, which essentially takes away the right of a woman to be able to choose, significantly rolls it back. And there's the fear that the court majority might overrule the historic Roe v. Wade decision from 1973. And the basis for that decision is the right of privacy, the right of individuals, adults, to make decisions concerning whether or not to have a child, whether or not, in previous cases, whether or not to use contraception. And that same right of privacy has been utilized for some of the most formative LGBTQ rights cases before the United States Supreme Court. So there was a case back in 2003 called Lawrence versus Texas, where the United States Supreme Court finally struck down laws that criminalized same-sex sodomy between 2 consenting adults happening in private. And those kinds of laws were used to justify discrimination against LGBTQ people. So it was struck down as unconstitutional, and the basis for that was privacy. Now, I know many of you are aware of the marriage decision that came out in 2015, Obergefell. And that decision in terms of the constitutional right of same-sex couples to get married and to have the benefits and protections associated with marriage, that was also based on this right of privacy, the right of two individuals to decide what kind of intimate relationship they wish to be in, and to have those protections and to make decisions regarding their own family. And so when we see an undercutting or an overturning of Roe v. Wade, which is legal precedent, we should be concerned about what that might mean. Not only, and believe me, there are many members of the LGBT community who also need the right to reproductive freedom, but also we need to look at it in the context, if we override this legal precedent for the right to have an abortion, what's next on the block? And once again, the basis for our seminal civil rights victories that we've had with the United States Supreme Court is based on that right of privacy. So we should be concerned about this issue, not only how it impacts a woman's health care and their reproductive freedom, but also what this means for the gains that we've made for LGBTQ rights. This is, I don't like to be an alarmist. I'm definitely a half glass full guy. And I do think we will eventually triumph, but these are very precarious times in terms of particularly with the United States Supreme Court. We have a 6-3 conservative majority, and there seems to be at least 5 of those conservative justices that are willing to overturn legal precedent. And 2 of the justices, Justice Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas, both have publicly stated that they would like to revisit the Obergefell marriage equality decision case. Amrita, you want to do the next question?
Yes, and I think that Cynthia might be a good person to answer this next one. Can the panelists say more about Governor Whitmer's task force on Title IX and transgender athletes? Will it reinforce and add specific language to affirm and reinforce inclusion?
Actually, I thank you for that, Amrita, but I think Jay is probably more able to speak to that, since Department of Civil Rights does not enforce Title IX.
So I'm not aware of the governor having a Title IX task force. That's news to me. And I'm not aware of any task force looking about, in terms with transgender athletes. Christina, I know we talked about this earlier today. We know that the Michigan High School Athletic Association has a particular position in terms of transgender athletes participating in high school interscholastic sports.
Yeah, so a couple different things. One, what Jay and I talked about this morning, I also am not aware of this task force. That doesn't mean it couldn't exist. School law is a crazy place right now, so there's a lot going on. But what Jay mentioned, the Michigan High School Athletic Association has their own process for assessing whether transgender students will be eligible to play on high school athletic sports on those teams, and whether those teams will be able to compete in like state tournaments and things like that. I have not run into a student who's been denied by MHSAA yet. And then the other piece is Michigan already has a law in the revised school code that allows female students to participate on all interscholastic sports, including traditionally male teams. So students who are transgender male students, technically under the law, have a right to play on those teams. So the issue in Michigan is really just transgender female students. And like I said, in my experience, I haven't run across a situation where MHSAA has denied it yet.
Thank you, Christina. I just want to, I'm looking in the chat room and I see a quick follow-up question. Do supporters of the LGBT community understand the link between reproductive freedom and privacy issues? In other words, do they understand that they need to support reproductive freedoms in order to protect LGBTQ rights? I think, so we have an LGBTQ public policy group that is statewide, and a number of participants, different organizations. Cynthia is part of that. The LGBTQ community centers, and we've been talking a lot about this issue and the importance of messaging, and that people understand that the right to reproductive freedom, the right to abortion, is an LGBTQ issue and people need to be involved. And you might be aware that right now there is a ballot initiative petition drive that would put on, that would, if they got enough signatures, it would be on the November ballot, which would inscribe in Michigan's Constitution a guaranteed right to have an abortion, as well as other areas of reproductive freedom. That's very, very important, because if the United States Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, which many people believe that they will do so, Michigan has a 1931 law that would be triggered, that automatically prevents abortion under any circumstances except to protect the life of the mother. There's no exceptions for rape or incest, and that law would automatically take effect. So you might have heard that last week, the governor filed a lawsuit to the Michigan Supreme Court asking them to find that this 1931 law at this point in time is unconstitutional. At the same time, the ACLU and Planned Parenthood also filed a lawsuit in the Court of Claims, also making that same request. What they're trying to do is to get a preliminary ruling in indicating that this law is unconstitutional, because the United States Supreme Court could issue its decision in the abortion case any day now, all the way up until June, and we want to get a ruling, or at least an injunction, against enforcing the 1931 law before the United States Supreme Court issues its decision. So really, time is of the essence. And so to answer your question, Laura, yes, we are trying to, we are communicating and we are messaging within our community to make that connection so people understand. And of course, we have many individuals in the LGBT community who might need the ability to access an abortion, or and certainly to make decisions concerning reproductive freedom, who are impacted by what the Supreme Court, US Supreme Court, does on the issue of abortion.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in here, Jay, real quick, just to clarify, a lot of times these conversations are framed in terms of women's rights, but I want to be clear, this includes trans men, non-binary people, anyone who has a uterus is going to be impacted by this. And so really making that conversation super inclusive as well, because I think, as we're saying, these two issues are so closely intertwined that using it as an opportunity to also broaden the conversation, I think, is going to move things forward as well.
Sure. Thank you, Mo. That's very important. And Rissa, do you have, any other questions that are in there? I can't see everything that's in the chat, so.
Yeah, so there's a question about if the Supreme Court were to rule in our favor, I'm assuming on issues like don't say gay or participation in athletics, would that protect our rights in Michigan, even if we lose our supportive governor?
That would, but I think the reality, given what the current court is right now, 6-3 conservative majority lifetime appointment, it's highly unlikely that we can rely on the US Supreme Court to protect those rights at this point in time. We might be able to rely on our state court to maybe do some of those things in currently with the current Michigan Supreme Court. And we do elect our justices, so another reason why the importance of being involved in this election.
Shannon has clarified she means the Michigan Supreme Court case. And yes, that is very different.
Yeah. So we possibly might, it's interesting. We always look to our federal courts to be able, with regards to LGBTQ rights, we've been able to rely on that for so many years. But during the Trump administration, President Trump was able to appoint more judges to the federal bench than any president in the history in a one-term period. And a significant portion of those judges, about at least a third of them, were known to have issued decisions antithetical to LGBT rights. And those are lifetime appointments. And so, for instance, Christina talked about the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Several years ago, we could look to that court, maybe a chance to get a good decision because you had maybe a progressive majority, and then that changed, and then it became almost equal with some of the appointments that the previous administration were able to make. Now it's clearly a conservative majority on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, of course, presidents can change. President Biden is appointing a lot of judges now, and that might even things out eventually. But right now, the reliance on the federal courts for the most part for LGBT rights, it's just kind of an iffy proposition.
For sure. We do have another question from Melissa. They're in Oxford, but the case is in Lapeer. It's a specific case to them. And they are trying to get puberty blockers for their child, but coming up on barriers with another parent and are involved in a legal fight. Any insight as to what they can do in the situation? And Melissa, feel free to take yourself off mute and explain your situation in more detail.
So I take it this is a situation where both parents aren't in agreement with regards to the puberty blockers. Is that correct?
I concur. Yeah.
Okay.
I've had, she's known since she was 2. As soon as she could speak, she was fighting it. And I've thrown the male stuff at her. Long story short, it just wasn't happening. And then her dad did not want to participate in any way, shape, or form. Since then, we have been in court about it. And unfortunately, he's had no legal counsel. I've had legal counsel. And every time this happens, for whatever reason, I'm coming against the fact that I met with the school without his knowing, but I literally came back to home and called him and told him. I actually talked to you at one point, but long story short, I got a violation for that. Even though I came to him, we were in agreement with it. I came to the court for it, and they said because I did without his knowing, I was doing a life-changing event.
Mhm.
Since then, he has cut her hair against her willing, her saying no. And long story short, I'm not getting any resolve with that. So I'm trying to figure out what my next course would be.
Mhm. So you raise a couple issues, and maybe I'll just focus in terms of the family law issue. You're right. The court has jurisdiction over the divorce, and with regards to, I'm assuming you're sharing custody and
Yes.
a decision where there's a division. And I think you have to probably go through the front of the court, and there'll probably a guardian ad litem appointed for your child, and you want to present evidence and information and regarding the efficacy and the importance of gender affirming treatment. And then ultimately it'll be the court that will be making that decision. With regards to school issues, I don't see Christina now. We talked about it, what does a school do when parents don't agree about how they want their child to be treated in school? And Christina, are you still there?
She had a sick baby and had to hop off.
Oh, sure,
Yeah.
sure, understandably, yes. So basically what we kind of advise school districts with regards to an issue like that is at all costs to try to communicate with both parents to see if there can be some kind of resolution reached in terms of focusing on
The school has been taken care of. He signed an agreement that it was okay for her to go by her pronouns.
Great.
My concern is that now she's 9.5 years old, and we're probably going to have to look at some blockers.
Mhm.
And I'm not getting any resolve with
Yeah.
the court system.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly you're, and I want to get too technical with regards to your individual situation, but
Right.
certainly your attorney could file a motion for the court to approve hormone blockers, hormone therapy for your child. And the court would address, obviously, he would oppose it, and you'd want to present evidence, showing the efficacy. Like I said, they'll probably appoint a guardian ad litem for your child, also to make recommendations regarding this issue. You want to talk to experts in the field, like Dr. Moe, on this issue. And this is something it's not going away anytime soon. And certainly in situations involving divorce, often parents will disagree with regards to things. And that certainly is true with how a transgender child is to be raised. Now, the idea about cutting the child's hair and, I'm not trying to put any ideas in the head or anything like that, but sometimes certain behaviors of parents who aren't supportive can raise issues that might have to be reported. I'm not saying this particular, circumstance, but there's a difference between not being supportive and sometimes being emotionally abusive, and
Right,
hopefully not physically abusive. So,
right. No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. Other questions, Amrita?
Yes, we have a question from Travis that I'm going to take a stab at first. It is the question that I love answering the most, which is that, well, much of the focus has been on state and federal policy. Are there things that can be done at the local municipal level in Michigan to advance LGBTQ policy? And what can those of us in progressive communities do to support those who may not live in as supporting and affirming places? There is so much that we can do. Our democratic institutions live at the local level, at your county clerks, at your local city council, even your school boards are super important. So the deadline to run for your local school board has not ended yet. It's actually in July if your community has a school board election coming up in 2022. So if you are a supportive and affirming parent, you should be running for school board. Even in progressive areas where you feel like, your school board knows what's happening, passing or having proactive good policy anywhere in the state bolsters the claim that we should be having this policy everywhere. So every little bit of good policy, progressive action really makes a difference. And if running for office is not in the cards for you right now, attending your city council meetings, talking to folks, doing the basic education work with your local elected officials goes a long way. That is a part of democracy that we can touch quite literally, right? These people live in our communities, go to our supermarkets. And so that is a really, really important way that we can be protecting our democratic institutions and advancing LGBTQ equality.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Amrita. And it's so important, the visibility of the LGBT community. Many times these policymakers feel that they can introduce this kind of legislation because they don't think they know anybody who's a member of the community. I certainly saw that true in Lansing on different policy issues. And the ability of members of our community to be able to speak up and to tell their stories, it makes it much harder to harm people when you know somebody. It's a lot easier when you don't think you know anybody. And certainly politics are local. And that's where some of the current leadership that is introducing some of these policies, they started at the local level, and we need to do the same.
I see a hand up from Mary Jo.
Yes, I think. I used to live in Holland, Michigan, and I'm sorry, with the pandemic, I've kind of forgotten. I now live in Watervliet, but I remember driving up there to support friends and family. I'm a former teacher on the north side of Holland and actually a year in Holland as well. But anyway, to have inclusive wording added to the city charter, which was just amazing because Holland, in case you don't know, has always been pretty darn conservative. And I think I left at 10 o'clock at night and listened all the way home. And then when I got inside, I thought it was problems with my feed because I often lose touch with internet. But apparently it was the city council. So just up to the vote, which was like 12:30 at night, and suddenly the feed went out, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, what happened?" Well, they voted like 8-1 to include that, and there were a lot of people there, speaking from the heart and telling their personal stories. And we had to sit outside. We weren't allowed to go sit in the chamber. But there were also a lot of people from conservative groups and church groups, especially, who are very concerned about, where are they going to get dressed if they have trans inclusive sports, and I mean, it was just like nuts. But I was so proud to say Holland is changing. Woo! So
Thank you, Mary Jo. That's a wonderful story. And it's really a tribute to the tenacity of the Holland LGBT rights community. It took almost 10 years to achieve that, but they didn't give up. They, very conservative community known as kind of DeVos country, and yet little, brick by brick, getting involved in local city council elections, electing, council members who'd be supportive of that, holding pride events. They just kept at it. And it just demonstrates that, people can make change. We can make positive change. We can stand, we can take a stand and accomplish things too.
I think that's a really good segue, Jay, to a question that was a little bit farther up in the chat. But just thinking about how the Michigan Supreme Court or even your local city council can give you rights that the state Supreme Court can't. And can you talk about how laws supersede each other in that way?
Yeah, so, at this point in time, I think there's 45 cities and townships that have local human rights ordinances that explicitly mention sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's great. And even at the most basic level, they help send a message that a community is an inclusive community. They also can send a message to businesses, to employers that, you can't discriminate. They're kind of a way to preventative measures. Now, truth be told, a lot of these ordinances don't really have in terms of much in the way of remedies. And enforcement mechanisms. You're not going to get the same enforcement that you're going to get with a state civil rights law or a federal civil rights law, but they do serve a very important function. And when you look at the civil rights movement with regarding civil rights laws that prohibited racial discrimination, they first started at the local level. You had cities. So for instance, Detroit had a housing ordinance that prohibited racial discrimination back in the late 1940s, before we even passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that's kind of the starter that helps us build momentum. And the more communities that we have that pass these local human rights ordinances, the more momentum we can have to say to our legislature, look, this is what people want. This is what's happening in the state of Michigan. This is a value that's important, and we want to see this translated into statewide civil rights laws.
There's a comment in the chat that I wanted to lift up from Dave Garcia, the Executive Director at Affirmations, that says, also consider helping to start an advocacy group at your closest LGBTQ center, even if it's all volunteers. Volunteers can change the world and certainly the neighborhood. Yes, 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 yes. My entire job, the reason why I am at HRC is to help volunteers do this and build their infrastructure in their communities. There's going to be a series of trainings about protecting democracy and how to get involved, housed at your local community centers, happening in May, June, and July. So be on the lookout for that information. My example that I like to hold up is Emmy Zanotti, who could not be on this call, but was a volunteer for the very first time in 2018, had been on the board of Stand With Trans for a while, but started volunteering and realized the power that she had volunteering, talking to voters, getting people registered to vote, and turned into a rock star campaign manager to help get progressives elected at the city council level. It's really accessible, and we would love to help you get there.
That's great. The important thing to keep in mind is that the majority of people are on our side. They do support LGBTQ rights. They do have an understanding what's fair. It's sometimes, the opposition voices that get so lifted up in the media, and then we get the impression that's how everybody feels. But that's not the case. But once again, I just want to go back. Some policy makers are banking on a certain sense of complacency within the LGBT community. The fact that this is a midterm election, the fact that we've been, exhausted by a pandemic and so many other crises, and that people are either going to stay home or they're not going to vote necessarily informed. They'll just, out of frustration, they'll say, let's vote all new, without having any understanding where anybody stands. And we owe it to ourselves to have the information and to have the facts and to really make some informed choices. If we don't have any further questions, I think we can wrap this up now. And I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Moe, Cynthia, Christina, who had to take care of her baby, and Amritha for being here tonight, and to thank all of you for participating. These are very interesting times and challenging times, but there's no doubt in my mind that we can meet this challenge. We just have to be prepared and do what we need to do. So hope everybody has a great evening tonight, and thanks again for being here.